They sent her as a joke. The whole town laughed when the wagon pulled away. A plus-size woman in a borrowed dress, sitting alone in the back like freight nobody wanted. Rhett Mercer had asked for a wife. What he got was their punchline. But here's what nobody in that town understood yet. The woman they threw away was the only one among them tough enough to survive what was coming. And by the time the dust settled, she wouldn't just survive. She'd be the reason everything standing on that land was still standing at all. Stay with me until the end of this story. If you enjoy it, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Marlo Quinn got married, nobody in her family looked her in the eye. Not her father, who sat at the breakfast table with his hat already on, staring at the black coffee in his mug like it had done something to offend him. Not her older sister Clara, who kept herself busy rebraiding her own hair in the cracked mirror by the door, fingers moving fast, like keeping her hands occupied was the only thing keeping her mouth shut. And certainly not her mother, who had pressed Marlo's dress the night before in near silence, smoothing out the wrinkles with a kind of focused, deliberate attention that looked almost like love. If you didn't know the woman well enough to understand, it was just guilt wearing a different face. Marlo ate her biscuit standing up. There wasn't a chair pulled out for her, and she wasn't about to ask. The dress had belonged to a woman in town, Mrs. Hadley's dead cousin, some said, or maybe a neighbor who'd left the territory 2 years back. Nobody quite remembered. It was a pale blue that had probably been pretty once, cut for a woman with a narrower frame, and Marlo's body strained against the seams in places that couldn't be hidden or apologized away. She'd let the side seams out herself, late the night before, by lamplight, squinting at her own needlework while the rest of the house slept. She hadn't cried about the dress. She'd been tempted to. There was a moment, around midnight, when she was pulling the thread tight, and she caught a glimpse of herself in the dark glass of the window. Her wide face, her thick arms, the way the cloth bunched and pulled no matter how carefully she worked. And something inside her chest clenched up hard and fast. But she pressed her lips together and kept sewing, because crying about a dress wasn't going to make her body different, and it wasn't going to change what was happening in the morning. Marlo Quinn had learned early in life that crying got you very little out in this country. What the day was this. She was 23 years old and being married off to a man she had never spoken to on account of an arrangement her father had agreed to through a third party after 2 seasons of poor harvests, a debt that had grown too heavy to ignore, and the not-so-subtle understanding that having Marlo in the house was becoming what the Quinn family quietly referred to as a burden. She'd heard them talking about it. She hadn't meant to, or maybe she had, a little. Late at night, voices carrying through thin walls. She's not getting younger, Robert. I know that. And she's not going to get any... Her mother hadn't finished that sentence, but she hadn't needed to. Marlo knew what she was in the eyes of people in this part of the territory. She was big and plain and too stubborn to pretend otherwise. She didn't simper. She didn't flirt. She read when she could get her hands on books. She had opinions about crop rotation and water drainage, and whether the county sheriff was an honest man. He was not. She made people uncomfortable in the specific way that women who think too clearly tend to make people uncomfortable, by noticing things, and by failing to look sorry about it. She was not what anyone meant when they said the word bride. So when her father had come to her 3 weeks ago, hat in hand, not quite looking at her face, and told her about the arrangement with Rhett Mercer up at the North Ranch, she had not been surprised. She'd been a lot of things in that moment. Cold, quietly furious, scared in a way she refused to show, but not surprised. She'd asked one question: "Does he know what I look like?" Her father's pause had told her everything. "He'll come around," he'd said. "Man out there on his own. He needs a wife more than he needs a pretty one." She hadn't answered that. She just nodded and walked out of the room. The wedding took place at the community hall in Grantham Crossing, which was the kind of small frontier town that took great pleasure in other people's business. It had a dry goods store, a livery, a postal counter tucked into the back of the general store, a saloon that smelled like its best days were behind it, and approximately 300 residents who collectively functioned like one enormous, slow-moving mouth, constantly chewing over anything that could be called news. Marlo Quinn getting married was news. By the time the Quinn family wagon pulled up outside the hall, there were already more people gathered than the occasion warranted. Women stood in small clusters on the steps. Men leaned against the post rail outside the saloon across the street, and children had arranged themselves along the edge of the boardwalk with the specific restless energy of an audience expecting a show. Marlowe climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. The step was high, and her dress was tight, and she was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her struggle, so she gripped the side panel, swung herself down, and landed solidly on the packed dirt with both feet. She heard something from the direction of the saloon. Low and mean, she didn't look. She smoothed the front of her dress with both hands, squared her shoulders, and walked up the steps. Inside the hall, the man she was supposed to marry was already standing at the front of the room. She saw him before he saw her, and she took exactly 1 second to look at him properly, the way you do when you want to form your own opinion before someone else forms it for you. Rhett Mercer was tall. Not just tall in the way frontier men often were, weathered and stretched out by hard work, but tall in a way that seemed structural, like the height was load-bearing. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that looked like it had been hit more than once and hadn't cared, and he was dressed in what was clearly his best shirt, which was still only a clean work shirt with the top button fastened. He didn't look like a man who'd tried too hard for this occasion, or not hard enough. He looked like a man who'd shown up because he'd said he would, and that was as far as his thinking about it had gone. He was staring at a point somewhere above the door. She walked down the narrow center aisle of the hall. Every head turned. She watched a woman in the third row nudge her neighbor and murmur something behind her hand. She watched 2 men near the back exchange a look, the kind that doesn't need words. She watched Clara, sitting in the second row with their mother, study the floor. She kept walking. Rhett Mercer heard her coming before he looked. She could see the moment he registered the sound of her footsteps. Something shifted in his posture, almost imperceptible. And then he turned his head and looked at her for the first time. She couldn't read his face. It was not a face that gave things away easily. His eyes, dark brown, set deep, carrying the particular flatness of a man who had seen the frontier do its worst and made his peace with it, moved over her once, quickly, and then settled on her face. He didn't smile, but he also didn't look away, which was more than she could say for most of the room. She stopped in front of him. The preacher cleared his throat. "Rhett Mercer," she said quietly, before the preacher could begin. She wasn't sure why she said it, maybe just to hear how it sounded. He looked at her. "Marlowe Quinn." His voice was lower than she'd expected, rougher. "I'm aware this wasn't what you planned on," she said, just as quiet. "I want you to know I'm not going to be a problem." Something moved through his expression, too fast for her to catch. "Wasn't planning on you being one," he said. The preacher cleared his throat again, more pointedly. They turned to face him. Behind them, the hall buzzed with the low sound of a crowd enjoying itself. It lasted 14 minutes. Marlowe knew because she counted. Counting things was something she did when she needed to stay steady, a habit she'd developed young, when the world got too loud or too sharp, and she needed something solid to hold on to. She counted ceiling beams, 9, oil lamps, 4 lit, 2 dark, rows of chairs, 11, and the seconds between each of the preacher's sentences, which were long and unhurried in the way of a man who understood that his was the only part of this proceeding that anyone was taking seriously. The vows were standard. She said them clearly, without stumbling. Rhett said them in the same low, uninflected tone he'd used to say her name, not cold exactly, but without warmth either, like a man completing a necessary task with appropriate attention. When it was done, there was a moment, strange and suspended, where neither of them moved. Then the preacher said something about a ring, and Rhett reached into his breast pocket and produced a simple band, plain silver, and slid it onto her finger without ceremony. It fit. She hadn't expected that. She looked down at it. "Wasn't sure of the size," he said, quiet enough that only she heard it. "It's fine," she said. There was no kiss. Nobody seemed surprised by that except the preacher, who looked briefly disappointed on behalf of his own performance, then recovered himself and announced them married to the hall. The applause was scattered, and somewhere in the back, she was almost certain, she heard laughter. What happened afterward was the part she would think about for a long time. There was a small gathering in the hall. Someone had put out a table with food, biscuits, a pot of beans, some dried fruit, and people milled around and talked in the way people do when they've come to watch something and now have to fill the time while they decide whether it was worth the trip. She stood near the food table because she had nowhere else to stand, and she listened. She was good at listening, better than most people realized, because most people didn't think about who might be listening when they talked. "Mercer must have lost his mind," said a man somewhere behind her left shoulder, or his eyesight. "You ask me, he's getting what he paid for," said a woman whose voice Marlowe recognized as belonging to Vera Whitmore, who ran the dry goods store, and whose opinion on everything was offered loudly and often. Town arranged it, town picked her out. That's what you get when you don't come down and choose for yourself. "Poor man." That voice was male, amused. "Poor man nothing. That poor girl is the one who's got to live out there, middle of nowhere with a man who barely speaks 2 words to anyone." A brief pause. "Well," said the first man, "at least they've got something in common. Nobody much wants to talk to either of them." Laughter. Marlowe picked up a biscuit. She wasn't hungry, particularly, but she ate it anyway, slowly, deliberately, looking at nothing specific across the room, because she was not going to stand at this table without something to do with her hands, and she was not going to let her expression show a single thing she was feeling. What she was feeling was something she couldn't entirely name. It wasn't quite humiliation. She'd been prepared for something like this, had armored herself against it on the wagon ride over. It was more like a specific, hollow grief for something she hadn't quite known she still hoped for until right now, this moment, standing in a borrowed dress in a room full of people who thought her life was funny. She had hoped, somewhere underneath everything, that maybe this would be different. She finished the biscuit. Across the room, she could see Rhett Mercer standing near the door, talking to no one, his hat in his hands, his eyes moving over the room with the slow, measuring look of a man taking stock of a situation he wasn't enjoying. His gaze crossed hers once. He didn't look away. Neither did she. Then someone spoke to him and he turned. She set down her plate. She was ready to leave. The wagon ride to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours. They sat side by side on the bench seat, and the road was rough enough that the wagon jolted and swayed and occasionally threw them into each other's shoulders, and neither of them said anything about it. The land out here was beautiful in the pitiless way of the frontier. Big sky, pale grass, the distant suggestion of mountains going dark blue at the edges as the afternoon stretched long. Hawks turned overhead. The wind smelled like dust and something dry and distant, like the land breathing. Marlowe had her hands folded in her lap and was watching the country go by. About 40 minutes in, Rhett said, "You ride?" She glanced at him. "Some. I've got a mare. Not fast, but she's steady." He paused. "You'd be free to use her." She turned that over. It was not nothing being told she'd be free to move around. "Thank you," she said. Silence again. "I'll tell you straight," he said after another mile or so. His voice was even, not harsh, not apologetic, just stating. "I wasn't told much about the arrangement ahead of time. I asked for a wife through the county board. I expected—" He stopped, seemed to be choosing words with some care. "I expected someone else entirely." "I know," she said. "I'm not saying that to be unkind. I didn't take it that way." He looked at her then, a longer look than he'd given her before, like he was reassessing something. "I run a cattle operation," he said. "It's hard work. The house needs attention. I don't have staff for the domestic side of things." "I'm not afraid of work," she said. "That's good." He looked back at the road. "I'm away from the house most of the day, sometimes into the evening. I eat what's there. I don't have expectations about meals being fancy. I can cook," she said, "properly. Not just what's there." Something shifted in his profile. Not quite a reaction, but close. "All right," he said. More silence. The wagon creaked. A coyote crossed the road ahead of them at a distance, paused to look, and moved on. "I won't pretend this is something it isn't," she said after a while. She was staring straight ahead. "I know what the arrangement is. I know what I look like, and I know what people said today, and I'm not carrying any illusions about any of it." She paused. "But I want you to know that whatever I agree to do, I'll do it properly. I don't do things halfway. That's not who I am." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of person are you then?" he asked. Not mockingly, like he was actually asking. She thought about it. "Practical," she said. "Stubborn, probably. I pay attention to things. I notice when something's wrong before it gets worse." She glanced at him. and I keep my mouth shut when there's nothing useful to say." He looked at her again, that same flat measuring look. "That's more than most people manage," he said. The ranch came into view as the sun was getting low, a cluster of buildings against the wide sky, the main house solid and square, the barn to one side and a bunkhouse further back, corrals with split-rail fencing, a water trough that needed repair. It was not a beautiful homestead. It was a working property, and it looked it, functional, maintained enough to be operational, but carrying the visible marks of years without anyone tending to the things that weren't strictly necessary. The porch railing was rotted on the left side. The vegetable garden, she could see the plot from the road, was full of weeds. 2 of the 3 windows on the south side of the house had their shutters hanging wrong. She made note of all of it without expression. They pulled up in front of the house and 2 ranch hands came out of the barn. Both men stopped when they saw Marlowe climb down from the wagon. She felt their eyes on her, not hostile exactly, but assessing in the particular way of men who haven't been told to expect something and suddenly have to decide what they think about it. The younger one, barely more than a boy, with sandy hair and a gap between his front teeth, pulled his hat off. "Evening," he said, directing it vaguely at the space between her and Rhett. "Marlowe Quinn," Rhett said, tying off the reins. "My wife. She'll be running the house from here on." Neither hand said anything to that. The older one, heavy-set with a dark beard going gray at the chin, looked at Marlowe with the flat expression of a man who had already made up his mind about something and wasn't planning to revisit it. He gave a short nod and went back to the barn. The younger one, she'd learn later his name was Cody, and he was 19 and had been working the Mercer Ranch for 8 months. Lingered for a moment. "You need help with anything, ma'am?" he asked. His tone was careful and genuine in the way of a young person who hasn't fully learned yet how to be unkind. "Not tonight," she said. "But thank you." He nodded and followed the other man. Rhett carried her single trunk up to the house. She followed him through the front door. The inside of the house was what she expected. Clean enough in the functional areas, dark, sparsely furnished, smelling of tobacco and leather, and the specific dusty warmth of a space that had been a bachelor's home for too long. There was a main room with a stone fireplace and a heavy table, a kitchen area that had good bones and terrible organization, and off a short corridor, 2 doors. Rhett stopped in front of the first one and set down the trunk. "I'll sleep in here," he said, meaning the far room without stating it. "This room is yours." She looked at the door, at the trunk, at him. "All right," she said. He nodded, started to turn away. "Rhett." She wasn't sure why she stopped him. He turned back, expression neutral, waiting. "Thank you," she said, "for being straight with me today. On the wagon." He seemed to sit with that for a moment. "I don't have a talent for being anything else," he said. Then he went to the kitchen, picked up the kettle, and started the fire. She didn't sleep well. The bed was an unfamiliar shape in an unfamiliar dark, and outside the sounds of the frontier night were different from what she'd grown up with. No neighbors close enough to hear, just the massive open silence of the land, occasionally broken by the sound of animals in the barn, or wind against the shutters, or some distant creature doing what creatures do out in the dark. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about absolutely nothing in particular, which was the specific mental state of a person who has too many things to think about and has decided, as a matter of survival, to think about none of them until morning. She was up before the sun. She dressed in the dark, found her way to the kitchen, and stood in it for a few minutes by the gray pre-dawn light from the window, taking actual stock of what she had to work with. It was not good. There was a small flour bin, about a third full, some dried beans, a side of bacon going hard, coffee that smelled acceptable, 2 crocks of something she had to open and smell before she could identify, pickled onions and something else. She thought it might be apple, but it had been in there too long. There were potatoes in a burlap sack in the corner, about half of which had gone soft. The salt was kept in an open dish, which meant it had been absorbing moisture from the kitchen air and would be damp and clumped. She sorted the potatoes, discarding the bad ones into a separate pile she'd dispose of later. She found a pan, a decent cast iron skillet, and a clay pot. She started the fire in the stove. It took 3 attempts because the damper was partially blocked, which she made mental note of. And when she had it going, she sliced the bacon thin and started it in the skillet, and set coffee water to boil. She was frying the better potatoes with the bacon drippings when she heard his footsteps in the corridor. Rhett appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed for the day already. Boots, work trousers, his shirt half buttoned, and his hair was damp, like he'd splashed water on his face. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her at the stove, then at the pan, then at the coffee pot. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Damper on the stove's blocked," she said, not turning around. "I'll see to it today." "I know about the damper. It draws the heat wrong, makes the stove about a third less efficient than it should be." A pause. "I'll fix it this week." "I'd rather fix it today. Do you have a long-handled poker and a rag?" Another pause. Longer. She glanced at him over her shoulder. He was looking at her with that flat, measuring expression again. The one she was starting to think was just what his face did when he was paying attention. "Back of the barn," he said. "There's a toolbox." "Good." She turned back to the pan. "Breakfast is 10 minutes." He came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee. He stood with it near the window, looking out at the corrals, and she cooked without fuss, and they existed in the same room without it being uncomfortable, which was something. When she put the plate in front of him, he looked down at it. "I told you I didn't eat anything fancy," he said. "It's not fancy. It's a proper breakfast." He ate. She poured her own coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and ate standing up, the way she had at her parents' house that morning. 1,000 years ago, it felt like, though it had only been yesterday. "You don't want to sit?" he asked. "I'm fine." He looked at her. "There's a chair." She glanced at the chair across from him. It was a sturdy, straight-backed thing. She sat in it. They ate in silence. But it was a different silence than the one on the wagon road. Less careful, she thought, like two people who hadn't decided yet whether they could tolerate each other and were not yet ready to conclude they couldn't. When he finished, he pushed back from the table and stood. He was pulling on his jacket when he stopped and said, without looking at her, "The hands eat at the bunkhouse. Cody sometimes comes to the main house if there's extra. The other one, Garrett, mostly keeps to himself." "The older one," she said. He looked at her. "You noticed." "He doesn't like the arrangement." Rhett picked up his hat. "Garrett doesn't like much of anything. Don't take it personal." "I don't take anything personal," she said. "I just like to know where things stand." He put his hat on, moved toward the door, then stopped, one hand on the frame, not quite turning. "Marlowe." "Yes?" "The house—" He seemed to be working towards something. "Do whatever you want with it. Inside, I mean. If it needs fixing, tell me. If it needs something, tell me and I'll see what I can do." She thought about the rotted porch railing, the crooked shutters, the weedy garden, the salt dish, the damper. "That may be a long conversation," she said. He almost smiled. She couldn't be certain. It was brief and slight and might have been her imagination, but there was something that moved at the corner of his mouth before he turned away. "I'll be back before dark," he said. And then the door opened and closed and the sound of his boots crossed the porch, and she was alone in Rhett Mercer's house, with a skillet to clean and a list of problems to solve. She cleared the table. Then she went to find that poker and the rag. The first time Marlowe went into Grantham Crossing after the wedding, she was 12 days into life at the Mercer Ranch, and she went for supplies. She went alone. Rhett had offered to come, briefly, in the way of a man performing the offer rather than expecting it to be accepted. She told him she could manage the wagon and the list, and she left at first light with the supply list she'd compiled over 11 days of meticulous assessment of every shelf, bin, and cabinet in the house and kitchen. The list was long. She had organized it by category: dry goods, hardware, medicinal, seed. She'd written it in 2 columns to fit on 1 page and still have room for the prices she intended to compare against what the dry goods store was charging, because she'd found, in the ledger she wasn't strictly supposed to look at, but which Rhett had not put away, that the Mercer Ranch had been paying about 12% more than the posted price on basic provisions, which meant either the person doing the purchasing was careless or someone was being creative with the accounting. She thought about that the whole drive into town. The main street of Grantham Crossing had the particular quality of a place that watches strangers, and she was apparently still strange enough to qualify. She tied off the wagon at the post in front of the dry goods store and was climbing down when she heard voices from the general vicinity of the water trough across the street. "Mercer's wife." "You're joking. That's—" "Same one. From the wedding." She didn't turn toward the voices. She smoothed her skirt, checked her list, and walked into the store. Vera Whitmore was behind the counter. The woman looked at her for one unguarded second, surprise, then something sharper, and then her face arranged itself into the specific expression of a woman who has decided to be polite in the way that is slightly worse than being rude. "Mrs. Mercer," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore." Marlowe put her list on the counter. "I have a supply order. I'd like to work through it item by item, if you have the time." Vera looked at the list. It was long enough that she blinked. "That's quite an order," she said. "The ranch has been undersupplied in several categories," Marlowe said. "We're correcting that." Vera picked up the list, began reading. Her expression shifted through several things in quick succession. Mild surprise at the specificity, then something that might have been reluctant respect, quickly suppressed. "Some of this we'll need to order," she said. "The castor oil. The extra flour won't be in until Thursday." "That's fine. I'd like everything in stock today, and I'll note the rest as pending." She paused. "I also want to go over pricing." Vera looked up. "I've been reviewing the ranch's recent purchasing records," Marlowe said. She kept her voice even, neutral, like she was talking about the weather. "There are some discrepancies I'd like to understand." The woman's eyes went flat and careful. "Discrepancies." "Items the ranch has been purchasing consistently above posted price. I want to understand whether that's an error or a policy." A silence. "I'm sure I don't know what you're referring to," Vera said. "I'm sure you do," Marlowe said pleasantly. "But we don't need to discuss the history of it. Going forward, we'll pay the posted price. For everything." She looked at the woman steadily. "That fair?" Vera stared at her for a long moment. "Of course," she said. "Very precise." "Good." Marlowe picked up her pencil. "Let's start with the flour." She was loading the wagon. Cody had come with her after all, materializing at the last minute with the explanation that Rhett had decided he should when she heard them. 2 women. She knew one of them, Helen Barrow, whose husband ran cattle 2 properties north of Mercer Land and who had made her social position in Grantham Crossing into a kind of full-time occupation. The other woman she didn't recognize. They weren't being quiet about it. Came in like she owns the place. "Did you see that list she gave Vera? How long was it?" "Pages. The woman has never been starved for appetite, that's certain." Low laughter. "Poor Rhett Mercer. He goes off and agrees to the arrangement, and look what they send him. You'd think they'd have the decency. He should send her back. Well, he's too proud. You know how he is. He'd never admit he got took. Still, I feel for him. I feel for the horse, is what I feel." More laughter, not even bothering to be quiet. Cody had gone very still beside her. He was 17 and he looked like he wanted to say something and didn't know if he was allowed. Marlowe handed him a sack of flour. "Careful," she said. "That one's heavy." He looked at her. His face was doing something complicated. "Ma'am," he started. "Load it behind the toolbox so it doesn't shift," she said. "But those women." "Load it, Cody." He loaded it. She handed him the next sack. She kept her eyes on the wagon bed, on the alignment of the cargo, on the list in her hand, checking items off as they were loaded. Her face felt like she'd made it out of something harder than skin, something with no give in it. She finished loading the wagon. She ticked the last item off her list. She checked the list one more time because she was thorough, and then she folded it and put it in her pocket. "All right," she said, "let's go." She climbed up to the bench seat. Cody climbed up beside her. She released the brake and pulled the wagon around. As they rolled out onto the main road, she passed within about 10 feet of Helen Barrow and the other woman, who had moved to the boardwalk. She did not look at them. She looked at the road ahead. She drove the whole way back to the ranch thinking about the ledger and the flour price, and whether the ranch's cattle numbers were being reported accurately at auction. Because she'd found something else in those records, something she hadn't fully worked out yet. But it nagged at her in the way that numbers did when they were lying. She didn't think about what the women said, or she tried not to. She mostly succeeded. He came back that evening to find the kitchen damper fixed, both crooked shutters rehung, the south garden bed cleared of weeds and turned over, the rotted section of porch railing replaced with a piece of wood from the back of the barn that she'd cut to fit herself, and dinner on the stove. He stood on the porch for a long moment, looking at the railing. She appeared in the doorway behind him with a dish towel in her hands. "It'll need a proper board eventually," she said. "That piece won't hold up past 2 winters, but it'll do for now." He turned and looked at her. That measuring look again, except something in it had shifted. She wasn't sure how to describe it. Less assessment. More like he was looking at something he hadn't expected and was in the process of recalibrating. "You did all this today," he said. "I went to town first. The supplies are stored." She paused. "There's something I need to talk to you about. Not tonight. I need to look at the records more carefully first, but soon." "Records?" "The ledger. The purchasing account." She met his eyes. "And possibly the cattle count." He was very still for a moment. "What are you seeing?" His voice had gone careful. "I'm not sure yet. I don't want to tell you something's wrong until I know what I'm looking at." She paused. "But I think someone has been taking advantage." Rhett looked at her for a long time. The dying light was coming in low and golden across the yard, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses made a sound and quieted. "All right," he said finally. "All right, you believe me, or all right, we'll discuss it?" "Both," he said. She nodded, went back inside, started dishing up food. He came in after her, hung up his hat, washed his hands at the basin. When he sat down at the table, there was a full plate in front of him. Proper food, not whatever's there, not thin broth and hard biscuit, but stewed beef and roasted potatoes, and something made from the pickled onions that, improbably, was actually good. He ate without speaking. She was at the counter going over the ledger she'd pulled from the cabinet, making notes in her careful, precise handwriting. After a while, he said, without looking up from his plate, "The women in town." She kept her eyes on the ledger. "What about them?" "Cody told me." She set down her pen, took a breath, looked at the ceiling for exactly 1 second, then looked back at her page. "Cody talks too much." He was upset. "That's kind of him." "Marlowe." She looked at him. His plate was half finished, and he was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something a little rougher than his usual flat attention, a little more present. "It's not what I expected," he said, "when I agreed to this arrangement." "I know," she said. She could feel herself going careful, the way she did when she expected something that was going to be hard. "I told you that at the start. That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I mean the town. What they said." His voice was flat and even, but underneath it she could hear something. "It's not right." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not." "I'll make it clear," he said. "If it happens again, if anyone— Rhett." She said it gently but firmly. "I appreciate that, truly, but I don't need you to fight my battles." She paused. "What I need is for you to let me do my job here. That's it." He looked at her. "The ledger," she said. "Let me finish what I'm looking at, and we'll talk." He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he nodded and went back to his plate. She went back to her notes. The lamp burned low between them, and the frontier dark pressed against the windows, and the house that had been empty of a woman for too many years sat quiet around them both. Not comfortable, not yet, but something. Something that had not been there 12 days ago, slowly finding its shape. The numbers didn't lie. That was the thing about numbers. They were indifferent to politics, to personality, to who you were or weren't in a given territory. They simply sat there and told you the truth, if you were patient enough and honest enough to read them properly. Marlowe had been patient. She'd been working through the ranch ledger every evening after dinner for 3 weeks, by lamplight at the kitchen table, while Rhett read or went over his own work at the other end of the room. She'd said nothing yet because she wanted to be certain, the way you have to be certain before you accuse the ground of being uneven, before you let yourself believe the world under your feet is actually tilted. She was certain now. She set down her pen on a Tuesday evening in late October, when the first real cold of the season had come down off the mountains and the fire in the main room was going properly for the first time. Rhett was on the other side of the table going over a contract from a buyer in the next county. She folded her hands on top of the ledger. "The cattle count is wrong," she said. He looked up. "Not by accident," she said. "Consistently wrong, in the same direction over 14 months. Every time there's been a head count for the records, The number reported is lower than what the actual count should be based on births, purchases, and losses. She turned the ledger toward him and put her finger on the column she'd been tracking. 7 head per quarter, roughly, sometimes 6, sometimes 8, but always below. Always the same direction. Rhett pulled the book toward him. He looked at her column, at the numbers she'd circled, at the running totals she'd written in the margin. He was quiet for a long time. "Who does the count?" she asked, even though she already had a theory. "Garrett," he said. His voice was flat, flatter than usual. She nodded. She'd thought so. The older hand, the one with the dark beard, the one who had looked at her the day she arrived like she was a problem he hadn't been warned about. "Has he always done it?" she asked. "Since the hand I had before him left. About 16 months ago." Rhett looked up from the ledger. His jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder than anger and more controlled. 14 months of records you've got here. "He started 2 months before the discrepancies show up," she said. "Could be he was being careful at first. Could be he needed time to find a buyer." Rhett stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking at nothing, or looking at the dark outside the glass, which amounted to the same thing. She waited. "If you'd asked me," he said finally, "I would have told you Garrett was the most reliable man on the property." "Most people who steal from someone rely on that," she said. Not unkindly, just true. He turned around. He was looking at her with something she couldn't entirely read. Not at her exactly, but at what she'd just put in front of him. The rearrangement of a certainty he'd been leaning on. "How many head?" he asked. "If my estimate is close," she said, "somewhere between 80 and 100, over the full period." She watched that land on him. 100 head was not nothing. At current prices, it was enough to matter. Enough to have bought someone a comfortable arrangement with a buyer somewhere who didn't ask questions about where the cattle were coming from. "I need to verify it," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "you do. But you'll want to do it without tipping him off. He'll move fast if he thinks someone's looking." Rhett looked at her. "How?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked her that. Asked her how to do something, as opposed to telling her how things worked. She noticed it. "Get an accurate physical count without using him," she said. "Take Cody, take someone you trust from outside the property. Count every animal you've got, pen by pen. Then compare it to what the record says." She paused. "Do it on a day Garrett thinks you're elsewhere." He was quiet, working through it. "There's something else," she said. He looked at her, waiting. "The buyer," she said. "Someone's been purchasing stolen cattle for over a year. That's not a small operation. That's organized." She chose her next words carefully. "I think it's worth considering whether Garrett is working alone or whether he's working for someone." The room was very quiet. The fire popped. "The Consolidated Cattle Syndicate," Rhett said. Not a question, like something falling into place. She'd heard the name, in town, twice, in conversations she wasn't supposed to be part of. "Tell me about them." Rhett came back to the table and sat down. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. "They've been buying up grazing rights across 3 counties for the last 2 years, pressuring smaller operations to sell or running them out when they won't. I've had 2 conversations with their representative, a man named Calloway, where it was made very clear they want this land. And you said no." "I said no." She looked at him steadily. "So they found another way in." He didn't answer, because he didn't need to. She watched him sit with that, with the particular ugliness of realizing that someone had been patient enough to work around him, and that the tool they'd used was the man he'd trusted most. "All right," he said after a while. His voice was quiet and deliberate. "We do the count." Carefully. He looked at her. "You should be there." "I thought you'd want to handle it yourself." "You found it," he said. "You should see it through." She looked at him across the table. He met her eyes. He wasn't offering her charity or concession. He was stating a fact, the way he always did, without decoration. "All right," she said. They did the count 4 days later, on a Thursday when Garrett rode into town on what he'd said was a supply errand. Rhett had gotten word to a neighbor, a taciturn older rancher named Ed Callum, whose opinion of the Mercer Ranch was apparently high enough that he came without asking too many questions. And the 3 of them, plus Cody, spent the better part of a day moving through every pen and pasture on the property in a slow, methodical circle. It was cold. Marlos wore her heaviest coat and her work boots and moved through the mud and manure of the corrals without complaint, counting alongside the men and recording the numbers in a small notebook she kept dry inside her coat. The cattle were not cooperative, particularly in the east pasture where a group of young steers had decided the morning was an appropriate time to be difficult. She spent 20 minutes helping Cody push them back to where they could be counted properly. And when they were finally done, she had mud up past her ankle and a bruise forming on her left hip where one of the steers had caught her with its shoulder. She didn't mention the bruise. She finished the count. The final number was 93 head short of what the record claimed. Rhett stood with Ed Callum at the fence of the main corral and looked at her notebook, and his face went very still in the way she'd come to understand meant he was controlling something. Ed Callum, who had not been told the details of why they were doing this count, looked at the number and then at Rhett, and then back at the number, and made a sound in his chest like a man swallowing something unpleasant. "I'm sorry," Marlowe said. She said it to Rhett directly because she thought he needed to hear it from someone who meant it. She was sorry, not for finding it, but that it was true. He looked at her. Something flickered across his face. Not the usual flat attention, but something underneath it. "Don't be," he said. "Better to know." Ed Callum drove home with the promise of his silence, which Rhett trusted, and Garrett came back from town that evening with no idea that his careful 14-month arrangement had just been pulled up at the roots. He would find out soon enough. But not yet. November arrived the way it always did on the frontier. Without warning and without apology, cold coming down hard off the high country, and the sky going the color of old pewter by mid-morning. The ranch work shifted with the season, the rhythms changing, and Marlowe shifted with it. She had started working outside in the mornings about 3 weeks after arriving at the ranch. Nobody had told her to. Nobody had told her not to. It had started practically enough. The kitchen garden needed to be properly put to bed for winter, and she wasn't going to walk past it every day and do nothing. And it had grown from there. She'd learned the fencing on the south pasture had 2 weak posts that would go down before spring if they weren't replaced. She'd seen that the water line to the far trough was developing ice in the mornings, which meant it was going to split before long if the drainage wasn't corrected. She fixed things as she found them, not because anyone asked and not to prove anything. She fixed them because they were broken, and she knew how, and leaving broken things alone had never made any sense to her. The hands noticed. Cody started bringing her coffee in the mornings without being asked. He'd show up where she was working, hand her a mug, and then pitch in without discussion. He was young enough that he hadn't yet decided she was something to be categorized, and that made him easy to work alongside. Garrett was a different story. He had not spoken to her directly since the first day. Not a word, not even a nod when they passed in the yard. She could feel his hostility the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. A pressure in the air, a subtle shift in temperature. He watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. Once or twice she caught it, his eyes following her across the yard with an expression she couldn't quite name but that sat uneasily in her chest. She said nothing to Rhett about it. Not yet. She was gathering something, though she wasn't sure what. Patience, maybe. It was Cody who told her one morning over that coffee in the east pasture what Garrett had been saying to the other hands. He told her the way young people sometimes tell uncomfortable truths, rushing through it, embarrassed, like the speed of delivery might reduce the damage. He's been saying, Cody stopped, started again, turned his hat in his hands. He says you're only here because the town had nobody better. Says Rhett got cheated and it's... He stopped again. Cody. She kept her voice even. Just say it. He says you're making yourself useful so you don't get sent back. That you're scared he'll see you for what you are, and... He stopped completely, looked at the fence post they were supposed to be checking. It's not true, he said to the post. What he says. It's not. She thought about that for a moment. The cold morning air came off the hills in slow gusts and stirred the dry grass of the pasture. What do the other hands think? She asked. Pete and Lou mostly don't care either way, he said. They just work. But they listen to Garrett. He's been here longer. She nodded. Thank you for telling me. Are you going to tell Rhett? Not yet, she said. Hand me the pliers. She tested the fence post. It was solid. She moved on to the next one. The thing about that kind of cruelty, the quiet, persistent kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself but moves through a community like water through cracked stone, was that it had a particular weight. Marlowe knew this the way she knew other truths about herself, not because she'd thought about it carefully in quiet moments, but because she'd been carrying it her whole life. She'd carried it when she was 12, and the girls at the schoolhouse had left her out of games in ways that were technically accidental. She'd carried it when she was 17, and the young men in town had looked straight through her at the prettier, slimmer girls behind her. She'd carried it 3 weeks ago in the Grantham Crossing General Store while Helen Barrow discussed her appetite loudly enough for the whole street to hear. You learn to carry it, or you put it down by lying to yourself about what it was. Marlowe had never been any good at lying to herself. What she was good at was not letting the weight slow her down. There was an afternoon, the second week of November, when she rode into the far west pasture to check on a section of fencing she'd flagged as needing attention. She went alone on the steady mare Rhett had offered her that first week, a stocky roan named Birch, who was indeed not fast but was sensible and sure-footed on rough ground. She'd been out there 2 hours, working through the fence line in the flat gray afternoon light, when she heard horses approaching from the north. 2 riders. She didn't recognize the first one, but the second she placed after a moment. That was Dale Whitmore, Vera's husband, who ran a mid-sized property 2 miles north and who had made a point of not acknowledging Marlowe at the one public occasion they'd been in the same room since the wedding. They pulled up short when they saw her. "Morning," she said. She was not going to be the one to make it strange. Whitmore looked at her the way a man looks at something that's not where he expected it to be. "Mrs. Mercer." The words came out like he was trying them for size. "Didn't expect to find you out here?" "Fence work," she said. She had the wire cutters in one hand and a pair of old leather gloves in the other, and she was not going to explain herself further than that. The other man, younger, with a long jaw and light eyes, had not taken his gaze off her since they'd ridden up. It was not a friendly kind of looking. It was the kind that measured things and found them wanting. "Is Mercer around?" Whitmore asked. "He's at the South Range today. Did you need him for something?" "Neighborly business," Whitmore said. "Not quite rude. Not quite not. I'll let him know you came by," she said. "Or if it's urgent, I can ride back with you." Something shifted in Whitmore's expression. Not quite surprise, but close. She thought he'd expected her to defer, to say she'd pass along the message and step back. Instead, she'd offered to ride with them, which meant she'd be present for whatever they needed to discuss, and he was working out how he felt about that. "It can wait," he said, finally. "All right." She put her gloves back on. "Good afternoon, gentlemen." She turned back to the fence line. After a moment, she heard them ride away. She stood there with her hands on the wire and her jaw set and breathed the cold air in through her nose, slow and steady, until the sound of their horses faded. Then she went back to work. Wab. She told Red about the visit that evening, not with any drama, just as a fact, over dinner, the way she reported anything she thought he should know. Whitmore had come by, she said. He'd asked for Rhett. She'd offered to ride back with him. He'd declined. Rhett had set down his fork when she got to the part about offering to ride back with them. "What did he say?" he asked. "That it could wait." Rhett looked at her for a long moment. She kept eating. "You know Whitmore is friendly with the syndicate," he said. "I suspected." She reached for the salt. "He was with someone I didn't recognize. Younger man, long face, light eyes." Rhett was still. "Describe him." She did. "That's Calloway," Rhett said. His voice had gone flat and deliberate in the way it did when he was controlling something. "The syndicate's man." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was the only warm thing in the room. "They came to your land," she said, "while you were away. And they came to the far west pasture, which is your most isolated section and the one with the weakest fence line." She paused. "That's not a social call, Rhett." He pushed back from the table. He stood with one hand on the back of his chair, looking at the wall, and she watched him think. Watched the way his jaw worked, the way his shoulders carried something heavy and didn't set it down. "They're moving faster," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think they are." She watched him stand there with the weight of it. 93 missing cattle. A man on his own property he'd trusted for over a year who had been selling him out piece by piece, And now the syndicate's representative showing up on his land while his back was turned. "What do we do about Garrett?" she asked, quietly. Because that question had been sitting between them since the day of the count, and neither of them had addressed it directly. He looked at her. "Not yet," he said. "If we move on Garrett now, Calloway knows we're onto them. Garrett will warn whoever he's reporting to." He sat back down. "We need to catch the whole thing at once." She thought about that, turned it over the way she did with numbers, looking for the edges, the weak points. "The auction," she said. He looked at her. "The spring livestock auction is in Grantham Crossing," she said. "Every rancher in 3 counties brings their stock. If the syndicate has been accumulating stolen cattle, they'll want to move them at auction. It's the easiest place to legitimize a large herd without too many questions." She picked up her pen from beside the ledger she'd had open before dinner. "If we can get there with our numbers documented, our real numbers, witnessed and recorded, and if the syndicate brings a herd that doesn't match their legitimate holdings, then someone with legal authority can make the comparison." Rhett was watching her, really watching her. Not the measuring look, not the flat attention, but something more direct than that. Something she wasn't quite sure what to do with. "The auction's not until March," he said. "Then we have time to prepare," she said. "But not to waste." He was quiet for a moment. "You think like someone who's fought this kind of thing before," he said. "No," she said. "I think like someone who's been underestimated long enough to know how to use it." She looked at him steadily. "People who don't think you're a threat don't protect themselves from you. That's useful." He held her gaze. She thought briefly and against her will about Helen Barrow on the street in Grantham Crossing, about Vera Whitmore and the ledger prices, about the whole town's comfortable certainty that Rhett Mercer had made a terrible mistake. Let them think it. "All right," Rhett said. "March." She nodded, went back to her ledger. Outside, the wind had picked up off the mountains, and somewhere in the darkness of the yard, a loose board on the barn was tapping, a small, persistent sound that nobody had fixed yet. She added it to her list. Winter on the frontier did not ease into things. It came down hard and stayed, and the Mercer Ranch bent under it the way everything out here bent, without breaking, but without pretending it didn't cost something either. The water line to the far trough split in January, exactly as Marlowe had predicted, and they lost 2 days to repairs and temperatures that made the metal tools burn cold through their gloves. One of the young steers got into a section of bad pasture and had to be watched through 3 nights of fever before it came back around. The barn roof developed a leak over the east stall that Rhett patched twice before Marlowe climbed up herself on a gray February morning and fixed it properly with a method she'd learned from watching a roofer work when she was 11 years old, which Rhett observed from the yard below with his arms crossed and his expression doing something complicated that he did not put into words. They had found, over the course of those winter months, a way of being in the same house that worked. It was not tender. It was not the kind of thing that would have made anyone in Grantham Crossing revise their low opinion of the match. But it was functional in a way that went deeper than functional, a rhythm they'd built without discussing it, the way 2 people sometimes do when they're too busy surviving to waste time on the architecture of a relationship. She knew, without being told, that he took his coffee black and strong, and that he was useless before the first cup. He knew, without being told, that she needed an hour of quiet in the evenings to work through whatever she was working through, and that interrupting that hour got him answers that were technically polite but carried a chill. She cooked real meals and he fixed the things she flagged without needing to be asked twice. He didn't comment on how she looked or how she moved or the space she took up in a room, which had been her quiet fear going in, that she would spend every day in this house feeling the weight of his disappointment, the way she'd felt it in her parents' house, in the town, in every room she'd ever walked into. And the absence of that was something she was still, months in, slightly surprised by. It was not love. She was not confused about that. But it was something real, built from shared work and shared trouble, and the specific intimacy of 2 people who have decided, without saying so, that they are on the same side. The plan for the March auction had been quietly taking shape all winter. Marlowe had rebuilt the cattle count records from scratch, a clean set of numbers, documented and dated, with Ed Callum as a witness and the physical count from November as the foundation. She had also, carefully and without drawing attention to it, begun tracking what the syndicate was doing in the surrounding territory. Bits of information came from different places. Things Cody overheard at the feed store, things Ed Callum mentioned when he stopped by, things she pieced together from the pattern of land transfer notices that the county posted quarterly. She kept it all in a notebook she stored under a loose floorboard in her room, which was perhaps overcautious, but she was not ready to be wrong about how dangerous this was. Garrett was still on the property. That was the hardest part of winter, watching him move through the yard each morning, doing his work, interacting with the other hands with the easy authority of a man who believed his position was secure. She watched him from the kitchen window sometimes, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but lived in the territory between them. Rhett had taken to doing his own informal checks on the cattle, casual, unremarkable, the kind of thing a rancher might do any day. And the numbers held. Garrett had apparently stopped taking cattle once the syndicate pressure had shifted toward other methods. Smart. He was waiting, she thought, for the situation to resolve itself one way or another before he moved again. She did not trust that patience to last. It was Cody who finally broke the surface tension of the whole winter on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of February, when he came into the kitchen looking pale under his tan and told her that Garrett had been seen, the previous evening, riding toward the Whitmore property. "At what time?" she asked. "Late," he said. "After dark. Pete saw him come back around midnight." She set down the jar she'd been storing. "Did you tell Rhett?" "Not yet. I came to you first." He paused. "Should I not have?" She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "No, you were right. Go get him." Rhett came in from the south field still carrying his work gloves and listened to Cody's account with the stillness he always used when he was deciding something. When Cody was done, Rhett looked at Marlowe. "He's tipping them off," she said. "He has to know we've been doing our own counts. Maybe he noticed something. Maybe Calloway told him to watch for changes in routine." She paused. "Either way, we're running out of time to get ahead of this." "The auction is 3 weeks out," Rhett said. "I know. If they know we're coming with documentation, they'll find a way to move the cattle before then, or they'll show up with forged papers of their own." He was thinking out loud, which he rarely did, and she recognized it as a sign of pressure. We need something they can't counter. She'd been sitting with a version of this problem all winter, turning it in her mind during the quiet evening hours, pulling at the threads of it. She looked at Rhett now and said, "We need a witness inside the auction who isn't connected to us. Someone with legal standing, someone Calloway can't dismiss or discredit." "The county registrar," Rhett said. "Tom Briggs. Does he know you? We've done business." "He's honest, old-fashioned about it." He paused. "He doesn't like the syndicate. They tried to get him removed from his post last year when he refused to expedite some of their land transfer paperwork." "Then he has reason to help," she said. "Can you get to him before the auction, without Garrett knowing?" "I can ride out day after tomorrow. Tell Garrett I'm going to look at a horse in Dulverton County." She nodded. "Take Cody. Not for safety. Just so there's someone else who hears whatever Briggs says." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not coming?" "No." She had thought about this. "If Garrett sees both of us leave together for 2 days, he'll know something's happening. I'll stay. Keep the routine normal." She met his eyes. "And watch him." There was a pause in which Rhett seemed to be weighing something. "Marlowe," he said. His voice had a careful quality to it that she'd come to recognize as the sound of him choosing between saying a thing and not saying it. "If he figures out what we know—" "I can handle Garrett," she said. "That's not—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying I don't want you alone here with a man who's been stealing from me for 14 months and who rode to Whitmore's property in the dark last night." She looked at him steadily. "Pete and Lou will be here. Pete and Lou follow whoever talks loudest. Then I'll talk loud." She said it without humor, but not without warmth. "Rhett, go to Briggs. That's the piece we can't do without. I'll manage everything here." He looked at her for a long moment. That look, the one she'd been cataloging all winter without meaning to, the one that had started as flat assessment and had shifted slowly and without announcement into something else she didn't have a clean word for. "All right," he said. He pulled on his gloves, turned toward the door, then stopped, one hand on the frame, the same way he'd stood that first night, in the corridor of the house, and told her to do whatever she wanted with the rooms. "You find anything with Garrett," he said without turning around. "You don't confront him alone. You wait." I know, she said. I mean it. I know you mean it, she said. Go. He went. The 2 days Rhett was gone were the longest of the winter. Not because of what happened, nothing happened on the surface, but because of what she felt underneath the surface of the ordinary ranch routine, like ice over moving water. Garrett watched her. She watched him watch her. It was a quiet, careful thing, done at range, across the yard, through windows. She went about her work with the same steadiness she always did, and gave him nothing to read on her face. She fixed the gate latch on the north pen that had been sticking since December. She inventoried the feed supply. She baked bread because the house needed provisions, and because the smell of bread baking was the most normal thing she could think of, and she needed normal to stay on the surface of things. On the second evening, she was in the kitchen when she heard boots on the porch, heavy, deliberate, and Garrett appeared in the doorway. He had never come to the main house, not once in the months since she'd arrived. She kept her hands on the bread dough she was working and looked at him. "Can I help you with something?" He came 2 steps into the kitchen. He was a big man, Garrett, not tall but wide across the shoulders and heavy in the way of someone who had done hard physical work for 30 years. His face, under that gray-shot beard, was carrying something she recognized as a manufactured calm, the kind of calm that takes effort. "Just checking on things," he said, "Mercer being away." "I appreciate that," she said. She did not stop working the dough. "Everything's fine here." He looked around the kitchen. At the ledger on the table, her heart gave one tight beat, but it was the household ledger, not the cattle records. And there was nothing in it he could use. At the shelf where she kept her notebooks. At her. "You've been busy since you got here," he said. The tone was almost friendly. Almost. "There was a lot to do," she said. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "Rhett's a simple man. He needs things simple." She looked at him. "That's so. He doesn't need complications." Garrett's eyes met hers. They were gray, pale, with a flatness in them she'd been seeing all winter and had never trusted. Things were working fine before. She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said pleasantly, "The bread's about done. You should get back to the bunkhouse before the cold sets in." Something moved through his face, too fast to name. "Yes, ma'am," he said, with a tone that made the courtesy feel like its opposite. He left. She listened to his boots cross the porch and down the steps and fade into the yard. Then she stood very still at the table for a moment, her hands pressed flat on the dough, and breathed. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to be nervous. And a nervous man making that kind of visit, with that kind of careful friendliness, was sending a message. Back down, or things get harder. She covered the bread with a cloth, went to her room, retrieved the notebook from under the floorboard and sat on the edge of the bed and went through it one more time. Not because she'd forgotten anything, but because she needed to feel the solidity of what she'd built. The numbers, the dates, the pattern, the truth, laid out in her own careful hand. It was enough. If they could get to the auction with Briggs present and their documentation clean, it was enough. She put the notebook back, went to bed, did not sleep well, but slept. Rhett came back on the third morning with Cody and with news that Tom Briggs had agreed to be present at the auction as an official county witness. Not announced, not advertised, just present, with the authority of his office and the record Marlowe had spent the winter building. He told her in the kitchen, quickly and quietly, before he'd even taken his coat off. She listened and nodded and poured him coffee and told him about Garrett's visit the night before. She watched his jaw set. "He came into the house," Rhett said. "He came to the door," she said. "He didn't touch anything, but he was looking." "What was he looking for?" "Me to flinch," she said. "I didn't." Rhett looked at her across the kitchen table. He was still in his coat, the cold still coming off him, and his coffee was untouched. He was looking at her with that directness he sometimes had. Not the measuring look, but the present one. The one that wasn't keeping its distance. "What did he say?" Rhett asked. She told him, word for word. She had a good memory for words when she needed it. When she finished, Rhett set down his cup. "He said things were working fine before." "Yes." "Before you got here," Rhett said. Not a question. That's what he meant. Rhett stood up from the table. He went to the window. That same window, the same gesture he'd made the night she'd told him about the cattle count, and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the yard where Garrett was, presumably, going about his morning work with the performance of a man who had nothing to hide. "We're 3 weeks out," he said. "We need him on the property until the auction. If he runs, Calloway covers the evidence and we lose our chance." "I know," she said, "but if he's warned Calloway about what we're doing, then we move faster than they expect." She came to stand beside him at the window. Not close. They did not stand close as a habit, were not people who touched casually, but near enough that she was in his sightline. "The auction is March 14th. Briggs will be there. Our records are clean. Calloway doesn't know about Briggs. And Garrett—" She paused, thinking it through. "Garrett is the kind of man who watches and waits. He came to the house to feel me out, not to do anything. He's not going to move without instructions. And if Calloway gives him instructions—" She thought about the syndicate, about men who built operations across 3 counties, who bought off county employees and pressured small ranchers and embedded their own people on other people's land. She thought about how they moved, carefully, legally enough, letting the machinery of intimidation do its work slowly and officially, so nothing stuck to them directly. "They won't burn it down before they know they've lost," she said. "Men like Calloway don't destroy what they still think they can take." Rhett turned his head and looked at her. "You sound sure of that," he said. "I'm not completely sure," she said. "I'm mostly sure. And mostly is what we have." He almost made that sound again, the one that was almost a laugh, brief and quiet, that she'd heard twice in 4 months and had stopped pretending she didn't notice. "All right," he said. "I want to be at the auction," she said. He looked at her. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "Do you? You're going to say it could get dangerous, and that I should stay here where it's—" "I wasn't going to say that," he said. She stopped. "I was going to say," he continued, "that you should be there. You built the documentation. You know the numbers better than I do." He held her gaze. "And I wasn't planning on telling you to go somewhere safe. You've never gone anywhere safe since you got here." She looked at him. Something in her chest did a thing she chose not to examine too closely. "Briggs will expect to deal with you," he said. "He asked about you, actually, when I explained who'd built the records." "What did you tell him?" "That you were thorough," Rhett said, "and that you were right about everything you'd told me." She didn't know what to do with that entirely. She turned back to the window because she needed somewhere to look. "What exactly did Briggs say?" "He said," Rhett told her, with the precise flatness of a man quoting something he'd committed to memory, "Any woman who can rebuild 14 months of stolen cattle records from a bad ledger in 4 months is someone I'd rather have beside me at an auction than against me." She was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like a sensible man," she said. "Most honest people are," Rhett said. They stood there for a moment, side by side at the window, looking out at the cold yard and the barn and the gray February sky over it all, and Garrett moving between the corral and the bunkhouse without knowing that 3 weeks from now, the careful architecture of his arrangement was going to come apart in public, in front of everyone who'd spent the winter betting against Rhett Mercer's foolish marriage. "There's one more thing we need," Marlowe said. "What's that?" "When Calloway's herd comes into the auction pen," she said, "we need someone to recognize the brands. Our brands, altered, that's what they'll have done. Altered brands are difficult to fake perfectly." She paused. "I can do it. I know every animal on this property. I've been doing the counts for 4 months. Rhett looked at her. "You want to stand at the auction pen," he said, "and call out altered brands in front of the whole county." "In front of Tom Briggs and the whole county," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Not the silence of disagreement. She knew what that felt like. The silence of a man who was taking something seriously enough to give it the weight it deserved. "They'll come after us," he said. "After the auction. If it goes the way we're planning, Calloway and whoever's behind him, they won't just accept it." "I know," she said. "It could get bad," he said. Not a warning. He wasn't the kind of man who warned her away from things. More like a statement of shared reality. "This is what we're looking at. Are you looking at it with me?" She met his eyes. "We have 3 weeks to get ready for bad," she said. "Let's use them." The winter light came through the kitchen window, pale and thin, and somewhere in the yard the loose board on the barn tapped once in the wind. She'd never gotten around to fixing that one. and Rhett Mercer nodded slowly, and the decision was made between them the way their decisions had always been made, without ceremony and without waste. March 14th. The auction. Tom Briggs and the county record and 93 head of stolen cattle and the whole of Grantham Crossing looking on. 3 weeks. She went to put more wood on the fire because the kitchen was cold and there was work to do. The 3 weeks before the auction were the kind of quiet that precedes something. Not peaceful, but held. Like a breath you don't release because you're not sure yet what comes after. Marlowe spent them preparing the way she prepared for everything. Methodically, without wasted motion, and without letting her face show what was moving underneath. She made 3 clean copies of the cattle documentation, each one dated and signed by herself, by Rhett, and by Ed Callum as witness. She kept 1 copy in the notebook under the floorboard, 1 in Rhett's breast pocket from the morning of the 14th onward, and the 3rd she mailed to Tom Briggs 2 weeks ahead of the auction with a cover letter that was precise and businesslike and gave nothing away about how her hands had felt slightly unsteady when she sealed the envelope. Garrett stayed on the property. He did his work. He was careful and he was quiet, and he stopped coming near the main house, which told her the visit to the kitchen had not gone the way he'd hoped, and he'd decided to wait. Rhett had taken over the cattle counts entirely, casually, saying only that he wanted to be closer to the operation heading into spring, and Garrett had accepted that without visible reaction, which meant he was either very controlled or had stopped taking animals weeks ago and had nothing to hide in the present. She thought it was probably both. Cody had become, without any formal arrangement, something like her partner in the daily management of things. He was young, and he was sometimes careless, and he had a habit of talking when silence would serve him better, but he was loyal in the uncomplicated way of a person who has decided where they stand and has no interest in reconsidering it. He drove her into Grantham Crossing twice in those 3 weeks, once for supplies, once because she needed to speak to Ed Callum, and on both occasions he kept his mouth shut about where they'd been and what they'd discussed, which was more than she'd expected from him and more than she'd asked. The night before the auction, she sat at the kitchen table long after Rhett had gone to bed and went through the documentation one more time. She'd done it so many times by now that the numbers were part of her. She could recite the monthly cattle count variations from memory, in order, the way another person might recite something they'd learned as a child. She sat in the lamplight with the papers spread in front of her and checked every figure, every date, every signature, and found nothing wrong because there was nothing wrong. She had been too careful for there to be anything wrong. She put the papers back in their envelope, sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. She was afraid. She'd been afraid for weeks and had not said so to anyone because the fear was not the kind that would be helped by saying it aloud. It was the specific fear of someone who has built something carefully and now has to carry it into a room full of people who have every reason to want it to fall apart. She knew what Calloway was. She knew what men like him did when they felt their arrangements threatened. She had tried to think through every way the auction could go wrong and plan against each one, and she knew she had not thought of everything, because nobody ever does. She got up, put out the lamp, went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept. The morning of March 14th was cold and clear, the sky a hard, flat blue without a cloud in it, the kind of morning that feels like the world showing off. The wagon road to Grantham Crossing was rutted from last week's rain gone frozen overnight, and Birch picked her way along it carefully while Rhett drove in silence beside Marlowe on the bench seat, and Cody rode behind them on his own horse. She was wearing her best dress. She'd decided that deliberately, not the borrowed pale blue she'd married in, which she'd taken apart and remade into something else months ago, but a deep wool dress in a dark green that she'd made herself over the winter from a length of fabric she'd found at the dry goods store. It fit her properly because she'd cut it to fit her properly, without apology or compromise. She'd put her hair up. She was wearing the plain silver ring. She looked like herself, that was the point. They arrived at the auction grounds, a large open area at the south edge of town with permanent sale pens, a wooden auction platform, and a covered area for buyers and sellers, to find it already busy. Ranchers from across 3 counties came to the spring auction. It was the biggest livestock event of the year, and it drew a crowd that was part commerce, part social occasion, and all territory politics. She saw familiar faces from town, saw ranchers she recognized from property signs she'd read while driving the roads, saw men she didn't know arriving in groups of 2 and 3. She saw Tom Briggs almost immediately. a compact, white-haired man in a good coat standing near the registrar's table at the east end of the grounds. He caught her eye across the crowd and gave one short nod. She nodded back. She saw, 20 minutes later, Calloway. He was standing near the main sale pen with Dale Whitmore and two other men she didn't know, dressed in the kind of clothes that cost more than they looked like they cost. The deliberate style of a man who wants to project competence without drawing too much attention. He was perhaps 40, lean, with a careful quality to his movements that she recognized as the physical habit of someone who was always measuring the room. He hadn't seen her yet. Or if he hadn't registered her as significant, which amounted to the same thing. That was fine. She preferred it that way. Briggs is in position, Rhett said quietly, beside her. I know, I saw him. She scanned the sale pens. Where's the syndicate's herd? West Pen. About 60 head. He paused. I counted 23 animals with brands I don't recognize from any legitimate operation in this territory. She looked at him. You've been here long enough to count already? I got here early, he said. Simply. She almost smiled. 23 is enough, she said. If Briggs can document them before the sale starts, he'll need you to make the identification, Rhett said. He can record it. He can give it legal weight. But you're the one who knows what the alterations will look like. She knew. She'd been thinking about it all winter. The mechanics of brand alteration, the way a running iron could extend a line or close an angle to turn one mark into another. The Mercer brand was a simple M with a crossbar. It could be made into several other marks with the right adjustments. She'd sketched out the possibilities in her notebook months ago and had the variations memorized. All right, she said, let's go look at cattle. What happened at the West Pen in the 40 minutes before the auction officially opened was not dramatic from the outside. Two people standing at a fence looking at cattle, one of them a heavy-set woman in a dark green dress, the other a white-haired man in a good coat, speaking quietly while the woman pointed at animals one by one and the man wrote in a ledger. Nothing that would draw a second glance from anyone walking by. Inside of it, it was the most concentrated thing Marlowe had ever done. She worked through the herd systematically, starting at the near end of the pen and moving along the fence line. Most of the animals had no connection to the Mercer Ranch, legitimate stock from whatever legitimate sources the syndicate used to pad their numbers. But the altered brands were there, and once she started seeing the pattern, they came clear one after another like shapes emerging from fog. This one, she said quietly to Briggs. Left flank, the brand reads as a double bar M. The bottom curve of the right arm has been extended with a running iron. You can see where the original mark ends if you look at the scarring. It started as a single M with crossbar. That's our mark. Briggs looked, wrote. You're certain? The scar tissue on an altered brand is different from the original burn, she said. The color, the texture, the direction of the hair growth around it. This animal is 3 years old. Our records show a female calf born to our stock 3 years ago March, sold to no one, lost in no count except Garrett's. She kept her voice steady. I'm certain. They worked through 23 animals. She identified 19 of them as Mercer stock with alterations. The other 4 she couldn't be sure enough about to call definitively, and she said so, because being honest about the limits of what she knew was as important as what she knew. Briggs had 4 pages of notes by the time the auctioneer's bell rang. This is enough, Briggs said quietly. He looked at her with something she recognized after a beat as respect. Not performed respect. Not the politeness of a man trying to be decent to someone he privately discounts. Real respect. The kind that comes from watching someone do something difficult and do it well. This is more than enough, she nodded. What happens now? Happens. Now I speak to the sheriff, he said. I've already sent word this morning. He's on the grounds. A pause. This is going to move fast once it starts. You and Mercer should stay close together. She found Rhett at the edge of the main crowd and told him quickly what she and Briggs had established. He listened without interrupting, his expression going through that controlled stillness she knew meant he was moving past the personal part of it, the anger, the sense of violation, and into the operational part. What to do next? How to hold the line. Garrett's here, he said when she finished. She looked around. South end of the grounds, he said, with Calloway. He arrived 20 minutes ago. She felt something cold move through her chest. He rode ahead of us. Yes. How much does Calloway know? I don't know, Rhett said, but he's not behaving like a man who's been warned off. He looked toward the south end of the grounds. He's behaving like a man who thinks he's about to win something. That was either very good or very bad. She thought about it for exactly 10 seconds. Let him think it, she said, until Briggs has spoken to the sheriff. Don't go near Calloway. Don't let on. I know, Rhett said. And Rhett. She put her hand on his arm. It was the first time she'd initiated that kind of contact, and they both registered it briefly, without making it strange. Whatever happens in the next hour, you don't do anything that gives them a legal argument against us. We win this clean, or we don't win it. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. All right, he said. She let go. They moved toward the main auction area. The auction had been running for about 20 minutes, smaller lots first, the way these things always went, when the sheriff arrived at the syndicate's pen with Tom Briggs and 2 deputies. The movement of official men with purpose through a crowd is the kind of thing that people notice before they know why they're noticing it, and a murmur started moving through the auction grounds like wind through dry grass. Calloway saw them coming. She was watching him when it happened, watching from a distance of about 30 feet, next to Rhett, both of them still and quiet in the crowd. And she saw the moment he understood. His face went very carefully neutral in the way of a man who has been in difficult positions before and knows how to perform calm. He said something to the man beside him. The man moved away, quickly. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Aldous Cole, who Marlowe had decided months ago was probably honest but definitely lazy, stopped in front of Calloway with Briggs at his shoulder and said something she couldn't hear. Calloway responded. The sheriff said something else. Calloway's careful, neutral face developed a crack in it, fine as a fault line. And then, because these things move faster than anyone plans for, everything happened at once. One of Calloway's men made a move toward the gate of the West Pen. She didn't understand why immediately, and then she did. Because if the cattle left the pen, if they were moved into the general auction crowd, the brand documentation became harder to enforce. Rhett saw it the same moment she did and was already moving, cutting off the angle to the gate with the long stride of someone who covered ground fast when he needed to. Don't, Rhett said. One word. Quiet. To the man at the gate, from about 4 feet away. The man looked at him, looked at the size of him, looked at the expression on his face, which was not angry but was something more absolute than anger. The man stepped back from the gate. In the commotion that followed, the sheriff taking Calloway by the arm, the second deputy moving toward Garrett, who had gone very still at the south edge of the crowd in the way of a man calculating distance and odds, Marlowe stayed where she was. She stood in the middle of the auction grounds in her dark green dress, with her hands at her sides, and watched the thing she had built over 5 months of quiet, patient, careful work come apart in Calloway's face. She heard his voice rise, not panic but close to it, the specific pitch of a controlled man losing his control. You have no authority here. This is a legal sale. Those animals are registered in my name, whatever that woman told you. That woman, Tom Briggs said, in the carrying voice of a man comfortable with public proceedings, has provided documentary evidence sufficient for county review, which I am authorized to initiate. The animals in that pen are not going anywhere until that review is complete. The crowd that had gathered, and it had gathered the way crowds do when something is going wrong for someone powerful, went quiet in the particular way of people recalibrating what they thought they knew. Marlowe heard, from somewhere behind her left shoulder, a woman's voice say, "Is that Mercer's wife?" And another voice. Apparently she's the one who caught them. She didn't turn around. Garrett was taken into custody without incident. He did not look at Rhett. He did not look at Marlowe. He walked between the 2 deputies with his eyes on the ground and his face carrying the specific blankness of a man who has already started calculating what comes next and doesn't like what he's finding. Calloway was not arrested that day. There was not sufficient cause yet for that, Briggs explained to Rhett quietly, but the county review was formally initiated and the syndicate's herd was held, and Calloway was served with a notice that made his mouth go thin and white at the edges. He looked across the grounds at Rhett before he left. A long, flat look that contained something that was not quite a threat and was not quite anything else. Just the look of a man remembering a face. Then his eyes moved to Marlowe. She met his gaze. held it, did not look away. He turned and walked to his horse. The drive back to the ranch that evening was quiet. Cody rode ahead of them, at Rhett's suggestion, and they sat side by side on the wagon bench with the last of the March daylight going gold and long across the grassland, and neither of them said anything for a long time. It was not a comfortable silence. It was a tired one. The silence of two people who have been holding something very tightly for a very long time and are only now beginning to set it down. Briggs thinks the county review will take 3 to 4 weeks, Rhett said finally. Then it goes to the territorial court. Calloway will fight it, she said. Yes. He'll have lawyers. He'll argue the documentation. Probably. It'll hold, she said, not boasting, just stating. He looked at her. I know it will. She looked at the road. The mare moved steadily between the traces, unhurried, content with the familiar direction home. The cold was coming in off the hills again, but it was a different cold from winter, lighter, with something underneath it that might, in a few weeks, be spring. Helen Barrow was in the crowd, Rhett said. She had seen that too. I know. Vera Whitmore, the Perkins family from up the North Road. I know, she said again. They were watching when Briggs made the announcement, he said. Watching you. She was quiet for a moment. I imagine they were. Marlowe. His voice had that careful quality again, not choosing between saying a thing and not saying it this time, but something else, something she couldn't quite map. What you did today. What you've been doing since October. We did it, she said. No? He said it without force, but without give either. You found it. You built the case. You went to that pen this morning and identified 19 animals in 40 minutes. He paused. I want to say that clearly, because I don't think anyone else is going to say it the way it deserves to be said. She kept her eyes on the road. Something was happening in her chest that she was not prepared for and didn't have a clean way to handle. It wasn't the content of what he said. She knew what she'd done. She didn't need it confirmed. It was the way he said it. Straight. Without condition. The way he always said things, except that this time what he was saying was about her. Thank you, she said. Her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for. He nodded, looked back at the road. They drove in silence for another mile. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. Calloway looked at me when he left, she said. The way he looked, he's not done. Men like him don't accept a loss like this and walk away. She kept her voice even, because the fear she'd managed to hold at bay all day was starting to find the edges of things now that the immediate pressure had released. I think things are going to get harder before they get better. Yes, he said, quietly. I think so too. I want you to know that doesn't change my position, she said. She turned and looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at Calloway across the auction grounds, because this also deserved to be done straight. I'm not going to step back from it. From any of it. He looked at her. The dying light was on his face, and he looked tired, genuinely tired, the bone-deep kind. And something else, something she had been seeing in pieces for months, and hadn't let herself assemble into a name. I know, he said. I stopped expecting you to step back from things a long time ago. She turned back to the road. They were almost home when he said, very quietly, like a man saying something he's thought about more than once. I'm glad they sent you. She sat with that. Sat with the weight of it, the unexpected solidity of it, the way it landed differently from anything else anyone had said to her in as long as she could remember. The ranch came into view against the darkening sky. The square house, the barn, the corrals, the water trough she'd fixed and the fence she'd mended and the garden she'd cleared. All of it hers in some way she hadn't anticipated and couldn't have explained, not because she'd taken it, but because she'd earned it, piece by piece, in the cold and the mud and the long evenings and the lamplight. I'm glad too, she said. Rhett pulled the wagon up in front of the house. She climbed down and went inside to light the lamps and put on the fire. He unhitched the mare and put her up for the night. And when he came inside 20 minutes later, stamping the cold off his boots at the door, there was food on the table and the house was warm, and neither of them remarked on any of it, because neither of them needed to. But that night, after she had cleared the table and banked the fire and was heading down the corridor to her room, she heard him say from behind her, just once, just quiet enough that she could have pretended not to hear if she'd wanted to, Marlowe. She stopped, turned. He was standing in the main room with his hand on the back of his chair, looking at her with that direct, present look. Not the measuring look, not the flat attention, but the one underneath all of it that she'd been seeing for months and had not let herself call by its right name. Whatever comes next, he said. We face it the same way we face today. She looked at him, stood in the corridor of the house that had become hers, in the lamplight of the home she'd built from nothing, and felt the particular weight of being known by someone. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely. The way two people know each other when they've been through hard things together and haven't looked away. Together, she said. He nodded. Once. She went to her room. She slept well for the first time in weeks, and in the morning the work was still there, and they did it together, and the frontier pressed down on them both and found, as it had from the beginning, that neither of them would break. Calloway moved faster than she'd expected, and she'd expected him to move fast. It was 11 days after the auction. The county review was underway, Garrett was being held pending a territorial hearing, and the documentation Marlowe had built was sitting in Tom Briggs's office in a locked cabinet, officially entered into the county record. Everything was in the right place. Everything was moving in the right direction. And Calloway, who understood better than most people how these things worked, understood that once the territorial court got involved, the window for making problems disappear would close permanently. So he didn't wait for the window to close. The fire started in the east barn at 2 a.m. Marlowe woke to the smell of it before she heard anything. That specific wrong smell of wood burning in a place wood should not be burning, thick and resinous, and coming in under the door of her room. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she was fully awake, moving on the instinct of someone who has spent enough time in buildings made of dry timber to understand that 2 minutes is the difference between salvageable and catastrophic. She hit the corridor at the same moment Rhett came out of his room. He'd smelled it too, was already dressed from the waist up, his face carrying the stripped-down alertness of a man who had just been dropped into a bad situation and was already calculating. "East barn," she said. "I know." He was already moving toward the door. "Get Cody. Wake the other hands." "Rhett." He stopped, looked back at her. "The documentation," she said. "If this is Calloway." His face changed. Not fear. She had never seen fear on him exactly. But the sharp recognition of a man who understands that fire might not be the only attack. "I'll get it," she said. "Go!" She went back to her room, pulled the floorboard up with hands that were not shaking because she did not have time to let them shake, retrieved the notebook. The original copies were with Briggs and the court already. She knew that. But her own records, her own working documents, everything she'd built the case from, was in her hands, and she was not leaving it in a house that might be on fire in 20 minutes. She tucked it inside her coat, crossed the main room, went out the front door into the night. The east barn was burning cleanly, the way buildings burn when someone knows what they're doing. Not an accident, not a knocked lantern, but a fire set at the base with something accelerant, already 20 feet high on the east wall and moving. The light of it was enormous against the black sky, orange and violent, and the sound of it was a sound she'd never forget. A roar that was almost alive, almost patient, like something that had been waiting. Cody was already in the yard with a bucket. Pete and Lou had come out of the bunkhouse. Rhett was at the water trough, working the pump, his movements fast and controlled, and she crossed the yard toward him without running because running in the dark across uneven ground was how you fell, and she needed to be upright. "The animals?" she said when she reached him. "Out." Cody got the doors before it reached the stalls. He handed her a bucket without stopping. "We can't save the barn. We can keep it from the house." She understood immediately. The east barn was lost, too far gone, too fast. But the wind was coming from the west, which meant the embers would carry toward the house if they let the fire build. What they needed to do was create a break. "The water line from the north trough," she said. "If we wet down the ground between the barn and the house, the line doesn't reach. It will if we use the extension you bought in January. It's in the storage room behind the main barn." She looked at him. "You bought 40 feet of rubber line. It's on the left wall." He looked at her for exactly 1 second. "Cody!" he shouted. What followed was not heroic in the way stories make things heroic. It was 4 people and 2 reluctant ranch hands working in smoke and heat, and the wrong kind of light, hauling water and dragging line, and wetting down the ground on the south side of the east barn in a long arc, their eyes burning and their lungs burning, and nobody talking much because there was nothing to say that wasn't already being done. Marlowe worked the line with Pete, who had apparently decided, somewhere in the chaos, that his opinion of her was less important than the fact that she was the one who knew where the equipment was, and they laid water on the ground in long sweeping passes until the earth between the buildings was dark and saturated. The east barn burned to its frame. The house stood. Rhett was at the edge of the ruin when the fire had eaten itself down to something manageable, standing with his back to her, looking at what remained of the east wall, black timber bones against the dark sky, still sending up small tongues of flame where the wood hadn't fully gone. He'd been cut on the forearm at some point, she didn't know when, and the cut had bled down into his sleeve and dried there. He didn't seem to know about it. She came to stand beside him. "The horses are safe," she said. "The main barn's untouched. Most of the tack is out." A pause. "Cody got the feed stores." "I know," he said. His voice was flat and low, and carrying something under it she recognized as the specific grief of a man looking at something he built being destroyed. She didn't tell him it could have been worse because he knew that, and he didn't need her to make it smaller than it was. She stood beside him in the dark and the smell of smoke and let it be what it was. After a while he said, "This is Calloway." "Yes," she said. "We'll need to tell the sheriff in the morning. Briggs, too." "Cole won't do anything," he said. Not bitterly, just accurately. They had both understood for months that the sheriff's usefulness had limits. "Cole won't," she agreed, "but the territorial court will. Arson on property that is the subject of an active county review." She paused. "This is not going to help Calloway's case. This is going to make it significantly worse." He looked at her. "In the morning," she said, "we document everything, every detail of tonight. Time, direction of the fire, the accelerant smell on the east wall. I can smell it from here. That's not wood burning naturally." She looked at the ruin. "We add it to the record." "You're already thinking about the record," he said. "Not a criticism, something else. Something tired and quiet, and underneath the tiredness, something that moved toward her." "Someone has to," she said. He turned then and looked at her properly. The way he looked at her when he wasn't managing something, when the controlled exterior had been worn down to what was actually there. In the firelight, his face was exhausted and cut open and real in a way that she had seen building for months and now had no more reason to look away from. "You're all right?" he asked. "Yes." She paused. "You're bleeding. Your arm." He looked down at it like he was seeing it for the first time. "It's not bad." "Come inside," she said. "I'll clean it." He didn't argue. They walked back to the house together through the smell of smoke and the sound of the fire dying, and she cleaned the cut at the kitchen table while he sat very still, and neither of them spoke, and the lamp burned between them, and the east sky started, very slowly, to go gray. The weeks after the fire were the hardest weeks of the whole year. Not because of the work. She could handle the work. She'd always been able to handle the work. It was the sustained pressure of it. The territorial court proceedings moved forward, but they moved slowly, the way legal things move when one side has money and the other side has evidence. Calloway had lawyers from the Capitol who questioned the documentation, questioned Marlowe's qualifications to identify altered cattle brands, questioned the chain of custody of the records. Briggs held firm. Ed Callum held firm. Tom Briggs, in testimony that Rhett told her about afterward because she had not been in the room, told the court that the documentation was the most thorough and precise evidence of systematic livestock theft he had encountered in 22 years of county service. The sheriff's investigation of the fire went nowhere, as they'd expected, but the arson report filed by Briggs' office and attached to the existing county review did exactly what Marlowe had predicted. It confirmed to the court that someone with significant interest in the proceeding was willing to destroy property to stop it, and that observation was not useful to Calloway. What she hadn't predicted was Whitmore. Dale Whitmore came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week after the fire. He came alone, which was itself unusual, and he came to the front door, which was even more unusual. Marlowe answered it because Rhett was in the south pasture. Whitmore stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and an expression she'd never seen on him before, Something between shame and the particular stiffness of a man who has practiced what he's going to say and is hoping the practice holds. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." She waited. He looked at his hat, then at her. "I want to speak to your husband." "He'll be back in an hour," she said. "You can wait, or you can speak to me." He sat with that for a moment. Then, with the look of a man deciding something, "I've been asked to provide a statement to the territorial court about the syndicate, about Calloway." He stopped, swallowed. "I know what they did to your barn." She kept her expression neutral. "And? I've been doing business with Calloway for 2 years," he said. Not the cattle, not the theft, but the land transactions, the pressure campaign." He looked at the hat again. "I knew they were pushing Mercer to sell. I didn't know about Garrett until the auction." He paused. "I told myself it wasn't my business." "And now?" she said. "Now it is," he said. He looked at her. "I'm going to give the statement." She looked at him for a long moment. He was not a good man, she thought, in the way that some people were not good but were also not entirely lost. The kind of man who went along with things when it was comfortable and reconsidered when the cost of going along became higher than the cost of standing up. That was not courage, but it was something. "I'll tell Rhett you came," she said. "He'll want to speak with you." "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat back on, started to turn away, stopped. Without quite looking at her, "What you did at the auction, the records, all of it." A pause. "My wife said something afterward when we got home." He stopped again. "What did she say?" He finally looked at her directly. "She said she'd been wrong about you from the start." He said it plainly, without decoration. "I told her she wasn't the only one." He walked back to his horse. She watched him go. She stood on the porch for a moment after he'd ridden out. The same porch with the railing she'd replaced in that first week, good boards now, solid, and looked at the yard and the barn and the place where the east barn used to be, its ruin cleared and stacked by Rhett and Cody over 2 long weekends, the ground bare and waiting to be rebuilt. She thought about what Whitmore had said, about being wrong from the start. She had spent so much of her life being what other people were wrong about her value, wrong about her capability, wrong about what she was and what she could do. She had carried that weight so long it had become structural, part of the frame she'd built herself around. She wasn't sure what it meant to put it down. Wasn't sure she trusted the ground without it. But she was standing on it anyway. That had to count for something. The territorial court ruled 6 weeks later. Calloway's lawyers fought every line of the documentation and lost every fight. The altered brands, the stolen cattle count, Garrett's testimony, which he gave in exchange for a reduced sentence because that was the kind of man he was, and finally Whitmore's statement, which arrived 3 weeks into the proceedings and shifted something in the court's temperature visibly, according to Briggs. The ruling was decisive. The Consolidated Cattle Syndicate's land acquisition activities in the territory were suspended pending a full fraud investigation. The cattle held from the March auction were awarded back to their original owners, and Calloway was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, arson, and livestock theft. He was out of the territory within the month. Whether he stayed out was a matter for the federal authorities, Briggs told them. But the syndicate's operation here was finished. Rhett got word on a Thursday afternoon and came in from the South Range and told her in the kitchen, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand, looking like a man who'd been carrying something for so long he didn't quite know what to do with his hands, now that it was gone. She sat down at the kitchen table. She hadn't expected to. Her knees simply decided the moment warranted sitting. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She looked at the table, at her hands, at the ledger sitting open in front of her that she'd been working on when he came in. Not the cattle records, not documentation of anything criminal, just the household accounts, the ordinary business of a working ranch in early spring. Numbers that added up to a life. "The East Barn," she said. "We can start on it next month. If we do the framing in May, we'll have it closed in before summer." He was quiet for a moment. "Marlowe," he said. She looked up. He came to the table. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down in it. Not the way he sat when they were working, but the way he sat when there was nothing that needed to be done at this exact moment, which was rare enough that she noticed it. "I need to say something to you," he said. She waited. When the county board sent word about the arrangement, he said, I agreed to it because I needed a wife, and I wasn't going to find one by any other method. That was the honest truth of it. He looked at her steadily. I didn't know who they were going to send. I didn't know anything about you. I know, she said. What I didn't expect. He stopped, started again, and she could see the effort of it. A man who said what he meant when he had the words and struggled when the words were the kind that cost something. What I didn't expect was you, specifically you, the way you think, the way you work, the way you. He stopped again. I don't have a talent for this kind of talking. I know that too, she said. Her voice had gone quieter than she intended. I'm trying to say, he said, that I'm not glad they sent you because of what you did for the ranch. I'm glad they sent you because of who you are. He held her gaze. And I should have said it before now. A long time before now. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something in the garden she'd planted, and the spring wind was moving the new grass in the south pasture, and somewhere in the main barn, Cody was talking to the horses the way he always did, a low, steady murmur that drifted across the yard. She thought about the girl she'd been the morning of the wedding, standing in a borrowed dress in her parents' kitchen with nobody looking her in the eye, eating a biscuit standing up because no chair had been pulled out for her. She thought about the wagon road to this house, the first dark night in an unfamiliar room, the kitchen with its bad damper and its damp salt and its disorganized shelves. She thought about Grantham Crossing and Helen Barrow and Vera Whitmore and the sound of laughter from across a dirt street that she had swallowed and walked away from. She thought about who she'd been then and who she was now, and whether those were different people or just the same person with better ground under her feet. I'm not an easy person to be married to, she said, because that was true and it needed to be said. I have opinions about everything. I notice things that aren't my business and make them my business. I am not going to become smaller or quieter or more convenient. I know, he said. I want to be clear about that. Marlo. There was something at the corner of his mouth. I know. I have been watching you for 6 months. She looked at him. The lamplight was on his face. It was late afternoon and the light was long and warm, and it made him look less weathered than he usually did. Younger, like the version of himself he might have been before the frontier had done its work on him. I'm not easy either, he said. I don't talk when I should. I hold things too close. I trusted the wrong man for over a year and missed it. He paused. We're not a perfect arrangement. No, she agreed. But we're a real one, he said. She sat with that, felt the weight of it and the truth of it and the way those two things were, in this case, the same. Yes, she said. We are. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, rough, work-worn, the hand of a man who had spent 20 years doing hard things with it, and left it there. She looked down at it, at the plain silver ring on her finger that had fit the first time, that had surprised her then and did not surprise her anymore. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while, not talking, not needing to. Ian. Spring came properly in April, the way it always did. Reluctantly at first, then all at once, the grass going green in a rush, and the sky opening up, and the cattle moving to the fresh pasture with the particular unhurried authority of animals that know what they want. The East Barn went up in May, framed in 4 days with Ed Callum and his 2 sons helping, closed in by the end of the month and operational by June. Cody turned 20 in the spring, and Marlo made him a birthday supper that he ate 3 helpings of and then looked embarrassed about, and she pretended not to notice. Grantham Crossing changed, slowly and without announcing it. These things never happen the way stories make them happen. No single moment where everyone turns around and sees the truth and feels ashamed in unison. It was smaller than that. Vera Whitmore started pricing the Mercer Ranch's orders correctly without being asked, which was not an apology but was something. Helen Barrow, at the early summer social that Marlo attended because Rhett asked her to and because she had decided she was not going to be kept away from her own community, came across the room and spoke to her directly for the first time. Stiff, brief, with the particular effort of a woman who is doing something she has decided to do before she can talk herself out of it, and said that what had happened with the syndicate was a service to the whole territory. Marlo said, "Thank you." She meant it, in the limited way that she meant it. The The women who had laughed at her in the street did not become her friends. The men who had pitied Rhett for his foolish arrangement did not become his admirers overnight. The territory did not suddenly see her clearly because she had proven something. People's vision does not work that way. She had always known that. You cannot correct perception by being correct, not completely. What changed was smaller and more real. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer the punchline. She took up space in this community that was now irrevocably hers. And the community had learned, not all of it, not perfectly, but enough, that the space she occupied was one it would be worse off without. That was not everything, but it was enough to work with. She was in the garden in late June, the vegetable garden she'd cleared of weeds in her first week, and had been working since, which was now producing beans and squash and the kind of tomatoes that Cody stole and ate warm off the vine when he thought nobody was watching. When Rhett came out of the house and stood on the porch and watched her work for a moment, "Ed Callum's asking if we want to expand the south pasture," he said. "He's willing to take a split stake in the operation in exchange for the land and the labor." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. Thought about it. "What's his acreage?" "About 40, adjacent to our east boundary." "If we run a shared fence and water the south trough from the creek," she began. "I know," he said. "That's what I was thinking." "Then yes," she said. "It's a good offer." She looked back at the garden, pulled a weed that had been evading her for 3 days. "Tell him yes." She heard him move on the porch, then his boots on the porch steps, then the crunch of the yard under his feet as he came toward the garden. He stopped at the edge of it and looked at her among the tomato plants and the beans and the small, growing, imperfect abundance of the things she'd built from a weed patch. "You've got dirt on your face," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been working." He crouched down at the edge of the garden and picked up a bean pod that had fallen and turned it in his fingers. He was not a man who crouched down in garden dirt often. It was not a natural posture for him. But he did it without self-consciousness, which she had come to understand was a Rhett Mercer quality. He did things without apologizing for them. "Marlowe," he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. His face was serious in the way it got when he was about to say something he'd thought about more than once. "I know we're already married," he said. "I know the arrangement's been done since October, but I want to ask you properly." He looked at her steadily. "Whether you want to stay, not because of the arrangement and not because it's practical, but because you want to." She looked at this man, this difficult, private, honest man who had given her a house and the freedom to make it hers and the space to be exactly who she was without apology, who had stood in an auction yard and blocked a gate and looked at a man twice and said don't and been listened to, who had sat across a table from her in lamplight night after night and let her build something from numbers and patience and stubborn attention while he made coffee and didn't interrupt, who had held her hand when it was over and called it a real arrangement. "Yes," she said, simply, the same way he said things. "I want to stay." He nodded. He put the bean pod down. He reached out and, with a deliberateness that was very much the way he did everything, brushed the dirt off her cheek with his thumb. She let him. They stayed like that for a moment, crouched in the dirt at the edge of a garden in the June light. Neither of them easy, neither of them simple, both of them exactly where they had decided to be. "The south pasture fence," she said. "It can wait an hour," he said. She sat in the garden in the warm light and thought that this was the thing nobody had told her about survival. Not that it ends, not that it resolves into something clean and comfortable, but that sometimes, if you are stubborn enough and honest enough and willing to do the unglamorous work of building something real, it turns into a life. Not a perfect life. Not the life anyone would have designed for her. Her life. Built by her hands, held by her choices, and shared, finally, genuinely, on equal ground, with a man who had looked at her from the beginning and not looked away. The frontier went on around them, indifferent as it always was, asking nothing and offering nothing that wasn't taken by force or patience or both. The Mercer Ranch sat on its land in the long summer light, a little larger than it had been and a great deal stronger, carrying inside its fences and its framed walls and its turned earth the particular shape of something that had been tested and had held. Not because it was built perfectly, because the people who built it refused to let it fall. That was the whole of the story, and it was enough.